morning, Darren. You know, teachers at school, when they're watching the kids that are coming in the morning, and they know who the last 2, 3 are going to be that come dashing through the gates just before the registrars are about to become. It's been a bit like that this morning. Good morning, those of you that were here last night. How are you feeling? Good morning, those of you that weren't with us yesterday. How are you feeling? Better than them. I think you're probably right, Joe. Yes. So, good morning. Welcome to Sheffield, for those of you that weren't here yesterday. Welcome to the second day of the NAVCA Forging Community Conference. I think most of you probably know me by now, but those of you that don't, I'm Jane Ide, I'm Chief Executive of NAVCA, and I'm absolutely delighted to have you all here with us today. We had a great day yesterday. There was communal singing. Watch out for the bootleg video that will appear no doubt on a download near you sometime soon. People will fill you in on that if you don't know what I'm talking about. Today we have got an absolutely packed programme with some amazing, fantastic speakers. I'm really excited and delighted at how many people have been willing to come and give their time to share with us. So we've got a lot to get through and a lot to do, but you'll be, again, those of you that were here yesterday will be glad to know we're actually in this room for the whole day. We're not moving around the building and out of the building as we had to do yesterday. So I'm going to do some brief housekeeping, the obvious things. There are no planned fire alarm tests. So if we do hear an alarm, we will be leaving the building. There are the obvious exits. There's one just behind me there. There's the main door where you've all come in. I think there's another one down to the right. But obviously there will be fire wardens around if we should need them, and hopefully we won't. And if we do, then the assembly point is outside next to the climbing boulder. So feel free, if you need a bit of exercise, that's absolutely fine. Toilets are straight down the corridor in front of this main door. There's a disabled toilet up on the mezzanine floor which you can get to by a lift as well if you need to. We've got various coffee breaks and things through the day, and obviously lunch and what have you, but we'll get to all of that in due course. There is a hearing loop. I didn't mention that yesterday, but there is a hearing loop installed in here, so if you need that, switch the hearing aid to the T position, and that should work perfectly well. I'm going to just very briefly introduce you to the members of the team that are in the room, that aren't all of them. They're standing at the back, but I won't ask you to turn around when you can. Julianne, Pauline and Amanda are all there. Tom and Anna are around the place somewhere. If you have anything at all that you need to know about, or anything you need any help, grab one of us, we will do our very best to help. And the team here at the Community Centre are absolutely fantastic. I cannot recommend them highly enough, they've been brilliant. So if there's anything you need, just shout. So, I'm not going to say very much this morning because we have so many great people to hear from. But I just wanted to set a little bit of context about why we're here and why we've chosen the theme of today's event. We called it Forging Community. The themes we're talking about are place, people and purpose. And the reason for that is really simple. Those, to us, in the NAVCA team, are the uniting principles of what NAVCA's membership is all about. It's the one thing above all else that every one of you is focused on. And there's no question at all, I think, that now more than ever, those themes are absolutely crucial, not just to us here in the room today, not just to our sector, not even just to the communities that you all directly serve, but right now, to our whole country, to our society, to our culture. I was thinking just a couple of days ago, why have we not put Brexit on the agenda for this event? And I think it's true, that's the first time that word has been mentioned since we got here yesterday, certainly from this platform. And the truth is, an event like this, it's a year in the thinking, it's 4 or 5 months in the planning, it's 2 days in the doing. And I don't know about you, but 3 or 4 months ago, I was struggling to work out, actually, what does this thing mean to our sector? What should we be doing? What shouldn't we be doing? What should we be talking about? There's been a bit of a discussion around the fact that actually it's not being discussed, which in itself I think is really telling, because we're not a sector that's known for not talking about things that matter. I think it reflects, certainly for me, that complete uncertainty, that confusion, that we don't know what to do with it, so we don't know how to talk about it. But yesterday, today, as we are here, we know that those debates are going on in Parliament. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know where that's going to go. We don't know if we're going to have a government by Monday, by next week, whatever. Who knows? But it's becoming clearer and clearer and clearer that whatever happens between now and March, damage will be done. If our own government is telling us that this is not a great option for us, then I think there can be no question that our communities, and particularly, you don't need me to tell you this, the people that are most disadvantaged, that are most on the margins already, who were 10 years ago, who now, after 10 years of austerity, even more so, and God help us, come Brexit, whatever happens, that's not going to change. They need us to be doing what we do more, better, stronger, more powerfully, to try and support them through whatever it is that comes in the next 3 months, the next 6 months, the next 5 years. I'm out and about talking to people, and I have sensible people telling me to get a message out to our sector that if you run a food bank, for God's sake, start building up your stocks now because you're going to need them in April. I have sensible people talking to me about the emergency planning that is going on in case of civil disobedience. You can tell me more than I can tell them what the truth is in your communities and the groups and organisations that you're supporting, and what the messages are that we should be taking back to government and to others about what the real impact is of what's happening right now and is likely to be. And that's something I would like to hear from you today, in weeks and months to come. But the purpose of today is to help you and us, all of us together as NAVCA, meet some of those challenges, feel better equipped, I hope feel inspired and encouraged and challenged. We're definitely going to be challenged. I'm looking at Kathy, who's sitting here, she's going to be speaking later. There will definitely be some real challenges, I know. But we are a strong and powerful network. I don't think we've quite realised how powerful a network we can be, but by working together in the cause of local social action, in whatever context, we have power. And in this particular time, in this particular context, it's really important that we make the best use of that we can. So, I hope you enjoyed the day. I genuinely hope you enjoyed the day. We want to give you time and space to think, because I know you lot, you're rubbish at giving yourselves time. You're too busy thinking about everybody else that you're supporting. Give yourself some space. Give yourself time to reflect and enjoy. And enjoy the day. I'm going to hand over now to John, our newly elected, I must stop calling you our chair-elect, John, our new chair of NAVCA, as of yesterday evening, who is going to open the conference for me. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jane, and good morning. I hope everybody is wide awake and alert, particularly those who I left at about midnight last night, who seemed as if they were perhaps going to stay a little bit longer, enjoying the delights and the hospitality of Sheffield. Yesterday we had the opportunity to celebrate the contribution that Caroline has given to NAVCA and to our movement. And I don't intend to repeat the contributions that were made by Stuart Evrington and others yesterday to celebrate that and support. But I know not everybody today who's here today could be with us yesterday at the AGM or at the dinner. So I would just like, before I start to talk a little bit more about the conference, you ought to put your hands together to thank Caroline on behalf of NAVCA and our movement. When I was talking to Caroline last week, and we thought we'd found a really quiet French cafe near Euston Station, only to find that some construction company decided it was the time to start drilling or piling or whatever next door. But over the noise of the drills and the hammering, we were reflecting, and Caroline was particularly reflecting on the change she's witnessed over her 30+ years in our movement. And I think what we know is inevitable for the future in a period of enormous uncertainty, where we don't really know what's going to happen in the next 24 hours, let alone the next 24 months. We know there will be change. And there'll be some change which we can control, and some change which we have to hopefully anticipate, and some change which we have to react to. So I think today's conference is very much about taking the opportunity intellectually and emotionally, and I think the two things go together in our movement, to embrace change and to think what that change might mean for us in this period of uncertainty. We know there will be economic change. I am going to talk a bit more about Brexit in a moment, Jane, I'm sorry. But we know there's going to be economic uncertainty and change. There's technological change. There's a political change. But there's a change between the relationship between the citizen and the state. And it isn't just unique to the United Kingdom or to England. It's widespread across the Western world. And those things matter because our movement, our organisations, we are part of that civil society which is at the heart and the core of that relationship. So we have to think about it. And we just need to think about our history. Asif is going to speak following me, and he was on the advisory panel to the Julia Unwin review of the future of civil society. And if you read that report, and I'm not going to steal what Asif is going to say, but just look at the history and the way our sector, our movement has responded, whether it was responding to squalor and destitution as a result of the Industrial Revolution, whether it was responding to refugees following the 2 world wars, the displaced peoples of Central and Eastern Europe in that period, and indeed in the 1930s. Roll forward to today, where we have poverty and inequality on a scale unprecedented for an economy as rich and as wealthy as ours. Who is providing the food banks? I don't mean those Conservative MPs who go to the food banks for a photo opportunity to celebrate the fact that their policies have led to the need for the food banks. But those food banks are a practical example of our movement, of the sector, the voluntary community sector, social action, responding to need. But that doesn't stop us challenging the policy that lead to the need for food banks. We have to do the two in unison. But, you know, if we were just campaigners and in the policy wonks, we wouldn't be fulfilling our obligation and we wouldn't be fulfilling the needs of those we work with. So there will be change. And I think inevitably that change is going to lead to us as a sector, us as a movement, us as NAVCA, you as members of NAVCA. And as I said last night, I see NAVCA as the collective of everybody in this room and all the other members that happens to have an organisation that facilitates and enables it. The organisation is not NAVCA. NAVCA is you, the membership, and the social activists in every community in England. But we have to be ready to challenge. We cannot walk on the other side when we see injustice, when we see unfairness, when we see need. But we mustn't allow governments and officialdom also to be allowed to walk on the other side either. And I think that's going to be a big test for us. And I think it's a big test because actually we're all often in survival mode. And that's understandable because financial pressures, pressures on demand for our services. But somehow we have to think above that immediate. Now that's easy for me to stand here, I haven't got responsibility of running a CBS or equivalent. But actually, what really matters is the outcomes we can achieve and the people we can work with. And that should be our motivator. And I know it's your motivator and our motivator across the piece. And we do that because we're values driven. And I think, you know, it's a cliche, isn't it? We're all values driven. Starbucks is, Google will claim to be values driven. We may not share all their values, but we are values driven. Our belief in equality, of diversity, of fairness, inclusivity, decency, kindness. But those words mean absolutely nothing if we don't live them and behave them. They're not something to be printed on a nice laminated poster and put on the wall. How often do we see those, particularly in corporate HQs? It's actually about how we live and breathe those. And I think if we draw on those, it gives us the strength to challenge, it gives us the strength to know what we need to do. Because we don't always need, we can have all the strategic plans in the world, but we don't know what we might have to do tomorrow. And it's drawing on our values and our principles and our experience and our evidence of what is happening in communities and the people we're working with that enable us to do that. And we need to be engaged in the policy debate. Caroline said in her speech and presentation to the AGM yesterday, when she first got involved, we were perhaps more radical as a movement than we are today. And I casually said at the end of my little speech last night, we need to be radical again. And Kevin in particular, but other colleagues, came up to me and said, what do you mean by being radical? That's caught me out. The first trick of a politician is you need to know what your words mean before you say them. I'm looking directly at Joe Irving when I say that, and he'll know that from experience, not personally, but those he worked with. What do I mean by radicalism? Well, let me say this. To quote from Marcellus in Hamlet, something is rotten in the state of Denmark, but by God, there's something rotten in the state of England in 2018. We see Brexit with all the uncertainty it brings. And I do get a little bit despairing when I hear the sector talk about what may Brexit mean for the sector. Actually, what will it mean for communities? What will it mean for our National Health Service? What will it mean for food? What will it mean for social care? What will it mean for some of those disadvantaged communities? Because whatever form of Brexit we have, if we have Brexit, the economy will be worse than it, and less growth, be poorer, and there'll be more redistribution to London and the South East as a consequence. So, but also we know, the causes. Why did people vote the way they did? And I'm not going to give a political analysis of what happened, but it's inevitable. It was partly we have too many communities and people feeling left behind, isolated, marginalised, that everything is against them. And they saw, maybe they saw, this bureaucracy as they saw it in Brussels was the cause of that, but it was an opportunity to kick back. Again, that's not unique to this country. Look what happened in the States. Look what happened in France, Austria, Germany, and other European democracies as well. But we in this movement knew about those social problems, those economic inequalities. We should have been speaking louder about them before, and we need to speak even louder about them today. I think that's about being radical, about challenging. I think it's also about, recognising that we live in a society, and I said earlier, one of the richest, fifth or sixth richest economies in the world, depending on how you measure it, but still very wealthy and very rich. But we have record numbers of people living on the streets. We have 14 million people living in poverty, over 4 million children living in poverty. We have in-work poverty. We have families reliant, not least because of universal credit, on food banks. We have inequality of morbidity and mortality growing. That is wrong. A radical social action movement challenges that, draws on the evidence of the people and the communities we work with to speak truth and to power. So I think that's what I mean by being radical. It's about speaking up for our communities and speaking on behalf of our communities and giving voice to our communities. And I think we can do that, and we do it very successfully. But it's also about community. And I was thinking about the title when Jane told me the conference was going to be called Forging Community. And I thought, what do those two words mean? And I could see in the city of Sheffield, but certainly in the city of Sheffield a decade ago, you'd have known what forging steel was. Maybe less so today. And if you drive past Bramble Lane as I did yesterday on your way here, you see that Sheffield United Stadium refers to forging. And for me, forging means power. It means change. It means creativity. It means bringing together things to make something better. And that requires human effort as well as technological effort and capital. Then community. What does community mean? It means place, and I think place is really important. I'm going to say a few words about place before I finish. But I think for me, community means something more. It means solidarity. It means a mutuality. It means collectivism. It means a role for the state, but a role also for civil society, complementing and working with the state. And again, I think that's us articulating that and articulating our right to have a seat at those tables and be seen as part of that architecture, and the architects for the future is also part of us being radical. So I think community really does matter, and community can be on several levels, can't it? But community of place is really important, and we're going to hear from David later talking about place and how the voluntary community sector can be involved much more in place shape. But it seems to me that we've got to rebuild and reforge, to use a word, our relationship and partnership with the state organisations, local government in particular, but also the health service and police, in our places. And I know there's some fantastic examples of that working well, and you will know those better than I, where it is working well. But we also know where it isn't working well, where we've got to a position where too many in local government see us as contractors who can rise to their bid for some money, and literally to a bid to go for a competitive tendering process to get it, not as partners and representatives of communities who should be in the strategic decision making, in the policy making, in shaping budgets, shaping places, creating well-being, creating real opportunity for communities, and addressing, and seen us as having some expert. And I know there are those who say we should ignore experts in the current climate, but we do have an expertise because we have that direct experience in evidence, and we have to persuade local authorities and CCGs and police and crime commissioners to see us in that way. And we do that, I think, and NAVCA has a role in that, of taking, showing good examples where it's working really well, and helping and enabling our members where it's working less well to draw on that example, as well as us working at the national level with the LGA and others, but to make that movement happen. But place really is vital, and we are part of place, foremost part of place, and we need to hold on to that and to celebrate that. I think of all the national infrastructure bodies, we are best placed to represent place, because our members, you are in place, you work in place, you represent places, you understand those places, and that's a really important part of the agenda. The agenda, frankly, at a national political level, is less London SW1, it's much more town hall and elected mayors and combined authorities in the regional agenda. Jane and her team rightly do and are successful in having meetings with ministers and officials at NHCLG, as we now call it. What a department, it's changed its name more often than I think I've had hot lunches. I'm looking at Joe, I think worked there for a period, smiling at that point. And it was probably DTR, or the Office of the Deputy Prime Minister. But actually, no minister in the current government or in a future Labour government, if there is a future Labour government, is going to tell local authorities how to work with the voluntary community sector. At best, they may have some nice words, as in the civil society strategy, but there will be no direction, and there will be no resources to back that up. And there won't be the sort of, we had, lots of initiatives and money. Well, apart from parks, I've noticed MHCL have now got a pot you can bid to run a local park on a voluntary basis. But, that won't be there. We have to be in talking to elected mayors. We have to be in talking to the combined authorities, whether it's here in South Yorkshire, West Yorkshire, Greater Manchester, Newcastle, or Bristol, wherever. That's where the agenda is, and I think NAVCA working again with you to help shape those local agendas is going to be really important. We are moving, the political structures are changing, we have to be ahead of those, and I think we're well placed to be there. So again, I think that's part of our radicalism, is actually moving our way we're working. And NAVCA, Jane and her team have done a tremendous job in the way they've changed over the last 15 months. NAVCA is a very different organisation. But we're on a journey, and we have to go further. We can only go so far, or the team can only go so far, if you're part of that and working with us. So we need to be really focused on place, community, driven by our values to make all that happen. But we need to challenge some other things too. And I'm looking now at my friend Cathy Evans, who's going to speak later, because she and I have shared platforms and debated often, only last Friday in fact, in WC1 I think rather than SW1, that's behind Broadcasting House, at the conference centre, the fact that we've seen a change in the way public services are delivered. We've seen the marketisation and commoditisation of public services. I don't think that's what any of us in this room believe is right. But we've swallowed that lexicon. We use the same language. I talk to colleagues in the sector who talk about markets. They talk about being competitive, bidding. Now, I appreciate that's for the game in town and you have to do it. But we're not challenging that. We're not challenging that orthodoxy that says markets are best, that competitive tendering gets you better value. And I think you've only got to look at Brilliant and other examples, where maybe it doesn't always give you the best value. I thought that was fairly obvious. And we have to argue for relational partnerships between the public sector and our movement and your members and our members. But we also have to argue that actually what public services are about is serving the public, being responsive to the public, being accountable to the public, not accountable to markets. And that, to support a local infrastructure organisation through a competitive tendering process seems to me absolutely balmy. Who puts out, does BIS, the Department for Business, Enterprise and Science, or Innovation and Science, put out a tender for an organisation to represent industry, and it may or may not be the CBI that wins that tender, it might be Circuit. Why would we accept that our local infrastructure organisations, which are member organisations, representative organisations, that should be independent, yes, let's have some funding from the public sector, but be independent of the public sector and the ability to challenge and accountable to members. And I deliberately use that example of the CBI because I think, there are some parallels, there are differences too. Jane certainly doesn't get the salary of the Director General of the CBI, I can assure you. However, there is something about that. If we said that those organisations had to be tendered by government, we would say that's something wrong. And I think that, that really is the finest example of where competitive tendering has really distorted the system. Grants can work, and we need to argue that case, and we need to argue that the public sector, particularly local government, and the politicians specifically, need to see us as allies, not as something that, an organisation they only deal with through their procurement teams. The big focus in localities and places is economic development, growth, jobs. Exclusive growth is often used. I don't know who would want to have exclusive growth, though we probably have exclusive growth in terms when we have it in the national economy, but no one talks about it. You cannot have economic growth unless you invest and have social growth, stronger communities. And again, that's an argument we need to put, and we are really well placed to put that argument and to make that case. But we shouldn't, just in passing to local government, and maybe I put my hat on as a former council leader, we shouldn't just not local government. 40–50% cuts in their funding, no reduction in their statutory duties, increased demand. it's not surprising they're having to make difficult decisions. It'd be great if they, when and if they talked to us about those decisions and talked to us about how we might find different ways of delivering services, finding different funding streams because of the nature of our ability, and actually build up that total resource and community asset base. So I think NAVCA is well placed to be part of that agenda, but we can only be if we collectively in this room take that forward. So I hope today, in a conference that has an amazing lineup of speakers and provocateurs and contributors, and an even more amazing audience and participants, that we have the opportunity to reflect on why we're here and where our organisations are currently, why we believe in social activism, why we believe social activism and social action are absolutely vital for the future, not only in self-interest of ourselves, but much more importantly in the future of our communities and our country. To draw on our values and our experience into the debate, and to be open-minded and willing to change. You know, we can criticise government, and I'd be the first in the queue to do that, of all political persuasions. We can criticise local government, we can criticise the media, we can criticise everybody, and there's probably good grounds. But we cannot then assume we don't need to change either, and that we don't need to evolve. And you can change and hold on to your values, but actually work in a different way. And I think that's what we need to think about today. I hope we're going to be actively participate, and I hope we're, in a comradely and friendly way, we're going to challenge each other, question each other, and actually get that debate going, because that's so important. And let's today recommit ourselves to work for a fair and more equal and democratic society. I entitled this, my session, it's not on the screen, we have within our movement, within ourselves, the ability to make change, and change for good. Let's draw on that. I'm conscious too of a quote from Lyndon Johnson, former President of the United States. Leave aside his hideous policy in Southeast Asia, but his creation of the good society, not the big society, the good society, the most progressive action by a United States president since Franklin D. Roosevelt. And he said, yesterday is not ours to recover, but tomorrow is ours to win. And I think today we must really focus on tomorrow. I think if we're bold, we're principled, we can do it. I'm really looking forward over the next 3 years to working with all of you and the wider movement to make that happen. To paraphrase another more recent American president, yes we can do it, but only if we do it together. Thank you. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Asif, who's going to be our next speaker. He was on the advisory panel, I may have got it maybe in the advisory group, to the Julia Unwin review. He's Chief Executive of BROC from Birmingham, a charity working for diversity and equality. I'm sure he could say more about that than I possibly can, but I know he's going to give us a really stirring and provocative speech that's going to really get us moving for the next session. Thank you. Thank you.
Just been promoted. I'm actually Deputy Chief Executive. Right. Thanks, John.
But you see, the power of NAVCA can give you a promotion.
Brilliant. I'll sign up. Where do I sign? Okay. Thank you. Thanks for having me. As John said, my name's Asif. I was part of this inquiry into the future of civil society. And it was really good, actually, John. You were just talking about the future, you know, let's think about tomorrow, and that's really what the inquiry was all about. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what the inquiry did and what we learnt. But first, if you'll permit me, I was just going to ask you to have a quick chat with the person next to you, if that's okay. I always do this. What I was wondering, could you think about, because I mean, I know Jane, you were talking about NAVCA and the power that NAVCA has, in its network. What I would like you to do with somebody next to you, find a friend, is talk about who currently holds the power in civil society. Who do you think currently holds the power in civil society? And by civil society, we're talking about the voluntary sector, but much wider, you know, anything that's not really in the state or for profit. So it might be like a little WhatsApp group right through to big charities. Okay, so who currently holds the power in civil society? Just have a quick chat, a couple of minutes, and then I'll bring us back together.
Robin.
Thanks so much for that. I know we could talk about this for ages. Just a quick question, a couple of people. What did power mean for you when you were talking about power? What sort of stuff were you talking about? Money? Anything else? The people. Okay, cool. Innovations, power and innovation.
Influence.
Energy. Okay. Influence. Influence.
Where? Over the policies.
Over policies. Cool. One more? Who you know, like networks, that sort of thing. Agency. Great, okay. So the ability to act, there's power in that as well. Thank you. And the reason I asked that, I suppose, is that actually these are the sorts of questions we looked at in the inquiry. And we looked at it through a particular lens. What we were thinking of was, what does the future of civil society in England look like? If we're going to create a sustainable future for civil society in England, how could we do that? You know, what are the challenges within civil society? And one of the parts of that is, where is the power? You know, how are we arranged? What are relationships like? So that was a big focus for us. And to do this, what we wanted to do was to look forward over the next 10 years, rather than sort of just the next couple of years. And I think I was listening to Julia Unwin, the chair of the panel, talk the other day, and she talked about this Bill Gates quote where basically Bill Gates said something along the lines of, we always tend to overestimate the impact of change in the next 2 years, but underestimate the impact of change in the next 10 years. So we were thinking quite long term, really, around what the future of civil society is going to look like. So how did we do this? We did the sorts of things an inquiry does. You know, we called for evidence. So we had about 67 formal responses from lots of parts of civil society, academics, a couple of sort of public sector people as well, talking to us about, well, what they think the future of civil society is. We had a number of conversations that community groups organised as well. Seeing some nodding, maybe some people did that here, great, yeah. So 57 of them. I mean, overall we spoke to more than 3,000 people across England. We did some, what we call sort of deep dives, but we went to some parts of England and worked in a lot of detail with local people in that area to find out what was going on, what sort of challenges civil society was facing, what they felt needs to change, how they could have a more sustainable future. And I mean, the great thing was people really wanted to talk about this stuff. You know, that was really positive. As you can probably imagine, a lot of what we found was quite challenging stuff. I mean, John's already given a really good précis, I think, of some of the things that were coming out, you know, sort of feeling that our democracy is under threat, our demography is changing, you know, sort of tensions associated with changes in population in local areas, changes associated with digital sort of technology, automation, the impact on work, you know, where people find meaning in life. You know, our environment is changing very fast. Our economy's future, as John was saying, you know, is in question. So these were the sorts of things that were coming out. Many we spoke to, I think, felt that civil society has a really important role to play in addressing some of those challenges in society, but also felt that if we're going to do that, there are some things that we need to address, if you like, some things we may need to tend to, if you like, if we're going to be more effective and sustainable. So that's kind of where we were coming from, I suppose, when we were speaking to people. And in our first year, 4 main things that we found. And this, I mean, I would say this, you know, I'm kind of part of the inquiry. I feel like we really got out there and talked to people, you know, but I mean, there is something, I think, in the realities of working with some of the local people that we did. It brought to life some of these challenges that people were facing. The types of things we found were, we heard that people really care about place, where they live. Having places where people can meet is really important. And the panel itself, the inquiry, made a commitment to only meet, you know, in civil society spaces. But what that did was gave us quite a good insight into some of the challenges that these spaces face, you know, how little investment there are in some of these places, you know, the sort of disrepair. So there was this issue, I think, about place that came across as really important. We heard that people see civil society as a really important way to express their identity, but that sometimes the way in which that is done in civil society can be quite limiting. So, for example, people are sometimes asked to sort of speak only from one aspect of their identity, like their ethnicity, for example. And, you know, our ability to sort of understand the complexity of identity, you know, how that might intersect with gender, with sexual orientation, that sort of stuff, that wasn't really sort of, that was a challenge that people felt was there. As I said, we heard that work is changing, and where people find meaning in their lives, you know, is also likely to change as a result. You know, for many people, work has been a source of meaning, belonging for a long time. And what, you know, sort of as the future becomes about robots, you know, kind of where are we going to find that meaning? What role can civil society play in all of that? And also the way we organise isn't always right as well for what we want to achieve in civil society. You know, the flexibility of the legal structures. You know, we talked to lots of people who were talking about organising in much looser ways, you know, with different types of networks. So it felt that something needed to change there as well. Okay, so that was the first year. The other thing we found, which was really big actually, was that even though lots of stuff had happened in society around that relates to race equality, so for example, you know, sort of post-referendum, spike in hate crime, Grenfell, Windrush, you know, there were lots of things happening in the media, but very few people we were talking to as part of this inquiry into civil society were talking about race. We're talking about race inequality, racism, discrimination. So we felt like we needed to do a bit more digging around that as well, and we took a specific focus on that. So that's the first year. Fast forward to where we are now. You know, we've just launched the report, and this is This is what the report looks like, by the way. It's quite flashy, it's quite nice. But basically, what we found was that I think one of the biggest findings, and you won't be surprised to hear this, is that civil society really matters. You know, that there's a lot of expectation around what civil society can achieve, needs to achieve. And a sense that kind of the market sort of comes and goes, you know, the state, the role that the state plays in our lives is likely to change over the next 10 years. But one thing that has remained consistent is the role of civil society in, you know, sort of nurturing our democracy, creating a space in which, you know, we can talk about challenging issues and challenge the powers that be, you know, the influence that you were talking about. And also, you know, sort of expectation that civil society can help us to stitch up some of this fragmentation, you know, between, you know, around issues of wealth, age, race, you know, a role, people saw a role for civil society, and also around, you know, things like climate change, a feeling that civil society is one of the best places in which we can actually make an impact on some of these issues. So there was a real sense that civil society has a lot of work to do, and that it's in a prime position to do some of that. But then the other thing that really came across was that as the world changes, you know, in the ways that we've described here, so must we. You know, John was talking about the need for us to think about how we change. And I would say, I mean, without a doubt, the most controversial part of the findings from this inquiry has been that we've focused on the need for civil society to change rather than government, rather than business. You know, there's been a very strong focus on that for us. And we'd agree with lots of the criticisms. You know, yes, civil society does need investment to be heard. Yes, we do need a better relationship. But our argument in this report really is we could have greater, for us to have greater impact, if you like, we need to think about how we behave and our attitudes. That's the kind of biggest finding, I suppose, from this. And it's so important because civil society often is sort of the canary in the mine, if you like, for society. It tends to be civil society that knows about stuff before it kicks off, you know, sort of before there is tragedy. You know, I'm just thinking about things like, you know, like the Grenfell Residents Committee that knew about some of what, you know, was likely to happen way before, you know, the tragedy that happened. But I guess, but to be renewed, to be more effective, there are some changes in attitudes and behaviours. So that's what most of this report talks about. And I'd really encourage you to read it if you get the chance, or to have a chat with somebody about it. You might remember in the 90s, there was something called the Deakin Review that came up with this thing called the Voluntary Sector Compact. And basically what that focused on was the relationship between civil society and government. And it talked about things like John was talking about, like, you know, how do we have more equitable relationships in contracts? You know, how does government consult with us better, give us time to respond to these policies that you're putting out? We came up with something that was very much focused on civil society, and we called it the Pact. And much of what's in there, I think, is already present in civil society, but what we're arguing is that some of those behaviours and attitudes need to be nurtured more and thought about more purposefully. So just to end, the types of things that are in the Pact, P stands for power. So it talks about things like shifting power, but also using it more effectively. So I was thinking, you know, somebody, I can't remember, I think it was John, was talking about how some of infrastructure organisations at a local area represent local people, represent local communities. So there's something, one way we might think about power there is, you know, how do we represent, what does representation look like? Who holds the power? How am I using my power to represent at a local level? You know, these are sometimes some quite difficult questions to ask ourselves, but we think if we don't ask them, we're not going to be as sustainable as we should be. The A stands for accountability. Often we're accountable to funders, to government, but our accountability should be first and foremost to those that we work with and those that we serve. You know, and there's something about how we turn that focus a little bit to think about more shared accountability. The C stands for connection. How do we create spaces? You know, I talked about community spaces, civil society spaces. How do we create spaces that are more connected, more open for lots of people from different communities? How do we connect with each other better? And it sounds like the work of NAVCA will be central to some of this in England. You know, how you've already got these really strong connections at a local level across the country. How could we capitalise that? And finally, T stands for trust, which really recognises that there has been a lack of trust in charities, a lack of trust in civil society of late. But also, trust is probably one of our most important currencies in civil society. It's one of the reasons that we can get people to talk to and the local authority can't, for example. You know, there's something about us nurturing that trust, but recognising that we might need to act a bit differently or think a bit differently sometimes to gain that trust. And this isn't optional. You know, I think for us, we came to the conclusion that if we're to remain relevant, if we're to have the biggest impact we can in the next 10 years, then we need to think about these issues like power differently. I hope you'll enjoy the report and that you'll engage with some of these issues of impact in your own organisations. Thanks so much for your time. Thank you.
Asif's a lot taller than I am. Thank you so much, Asif. I think that was inspiring, encouraging. I was talking to Julia Unwin, I think probably a couple of weeks before the report came out, and she was talking to me about the pact, and it just seemed to me that those four themes of shifting power, accountability, connectedness and trust are absolutely at the heart of what I believe and have come to learn that NAVCA and NAVCA's members are all about. So I would agree with you. I think we're very much going to be in that space, and I think we can play a leading role in helping to move that forward, and I hope we will do. I think we may have a small technical issue, but I'm not entirely sure. But I'm about to introduce our next speaker, Nathan Yole from NPC, which is, of course, as you will all know, a leading think tank in the sector. You are going to have, I think, in this workshop, some time to move around. You're going to get to stand up, you're going to move your chairs, and then bring me back again later. While we're just sorting out the laptop, do take a moment if you need to just kind of stand up, turn around, stretch your legs, sit down again. I'm definitely channeling my inner primary school teacher today. While we just get the laptop sorted out for Nathan, and then we will crack on into the next workshop. Thank you.
Nice. Okay, everyone. I hope you are sufficiently flexed and ready for whatever participatory activity has been threatened. It's not that bad, don't worry. So, just to say before I kick off, there will be an element, maybe 15-20 minutes, so I want people to sort of get into 4 groups to have a discussion. Bearing in mind the audience I'm addressing, I'm not going to make any suggestion how you organise yourselves in this community space. But essentially, you will need to go into 4 groups. I need 2 volunteers as well. I've already volunteered John and Mike last night to kind of convene groups. So before I ask Alison to do it as well, she's not listening. Alison has just been volunteered because she's ignoring me. So, so if I could have one more person to volunteer to kind of do the feedback from their group. In which case I'll ask Jane to volunteer somebody for me. Give it some thought, but I will need 4. So, good morning everyone. Thank you very much for having me. My name is Nathan Yoll. I'm the head of policy and external affairs at NPC. There we go. So NPC is one of the leading think tanks and consultancies for the charity and wider social sector. It's been going since 2002. This is going I wanted it to do. And what most people know us as is we are the impact people. So essentially, we're very much on the provisional wing of sort of the impact movement, trying to ensure that everybody can maximise their impact and their evaluation tools to sort out exactly. This is going far ahead of itself. It's lovely watching you looking at Supergirl, but it makes no difference if it's not watching at the right time. So essentially, yeah. So our shtick has been for most of the time we've been around is actually it's about impact and getting charities to take it much more seriously to actually maximise our impact. For our communities and for our causes. But actually, I've been here since January, and I'm doing some much sort of crunchier thinking about actually what kind of policy areas can we have everyone and take a hand on as well. And specifically, I've been doing a lot of work on place. Now, just to tell you why that is the case, and this is a bit about me and where I've come from. So that is me at the back, dressed up as Supergirl. There's a reason for showing this slide. It's not just to get a cheap laugh out of you. The hungover ones. So essentially my background until this year is not in the charitable sector. I've spent the past 18 years working in politics, working in campaigning, and working in some public service reform type roles, specifically the LGA, which I think John has mentioned this morning, spending some time at the London Borough of Sutton as well, doing some public service reform there in the last couple of years. Definitely in Sutton, we had lots of spent a lot of time dealing with community action at Sutton with Alison Navarro, if any of you know about her. I was actually trying to think differently about how you get CVS bodies in the wider sector in at that point of creation with the local authority and the public service bodies to start deciding what the strategy or the vision or the route might look like instead of deciding halfway down the road you forgot to think about it, you now need to add you on at a later date. I'm a trustee myself of a very small charity back at home in Pontypool in South Wales, and that's where the photo is from, called Track 2, which is a tiny sort of crisis alleviation sort of anti-poverty charity based in the most deprived housing estates outside of Pontypool. And actually a lot of my work with them has really actually had an impact on my thinking in terms of my job at NPC, because essentially Torvine has a population of 90,000 people. We alone helped I think 280, 300 households last year, some of whom now are actually in really serious sort of difficulty and issues of isolation and poverty. And it's got to the point, if we don't exist, there is no other organisation in the borough, quite frankly now, that is there to pick up the pieces and to try to help to rebuild the lives and empower that community to be better. So it's made me think, actually, how can we properly rethink and recharge our relationships in the places where we live and when we do our business and actually make our lives, and how, if possible, in the current climate, we can press the reset button and have a better set of relationships. So that's why I've been doing a lot of work on place at NPC. I think everyone here would agree that essentially civil society and the spaces that we share together basically are the glue that binds our communities together, and that essentially we are all vital to the creation of that good society that we are all here to create. I think the relationship between the social sector and local public services is crucial to this, as we've heard already this morning, but also is under threat now as it hasn't, more than it ever has been, quite frankly, in our lifetimes, as the effects of austerity are testing local authorities, quite frankly, to their limit. Northamptonshire is an obvious example. It's been in the news quite a lot recently. is going to be followed into what is effective bankruptcy next year by a number of county councils. I was talking to one of the senior executives at Surrey recently, who's interested in actually getting more involved with the social sector. He turned around and said to me, I have to make £220 million worth of cuts by 2021. Now, good luck to him. Quite frankly, that will be nothing short of a fire sale, and there is no opportunity or ability in the next 2 years to try and do something meaningful and useful in that circumstances. I mean, despite what Philip Hammond suggested was an increase in local government spending in October's budget, councils still have to implement, I think it's £1.3 billion worth of cuts in the next 2-3 years, which essentially is the biggest amount of cuts that they've had to make since the in-year cuts ripped the guts out of a lot of that work that was being done in a positive sense in 2011. The settlement was postponed this week, which I guess in the whole quantum of where we are shouldn't tell us very much, but let's be thinking about it. Local government funding finance regimes are due to change in 2021 because of business rates. Local authorities do not know what they are going to be yet, so they can't even plan for what's going to happen in the future. It's a bleak. I'm not going to swear if you don't know anyone on it. I mean, this is obviously having a huge effect on the wider social sector. Oh, bloody. In research that was published earlier this year, I'll just let it go, 78% of local charities reported an increase in demand for services, and 85% are predicting further increases in the future. Of the respondents, only 14% felt they had sufficient resources to meet this need. And worryingly, over half of the charities that responded basically fear for their survival or their existence in the next 5 years. So as John has already mentioned, after a decade of austerity and with Brexit on the horizon, I think it's time that we need to take a radical rethink, basically, about how the public sector, the social sector, and the progressive elements of the business and commercial sectors can work together to both pool and maximise our resources and our expertise, and then maximise our collective impact in those places, basically, that we call home, where we live and where we basically foster the kind of lives we want. So essentially, it's all about how can we put our prejudices aside and come together to put local people and local communities and our local places in the driving seat for meaningful social and economic change in the future, and try and get out of the wreckage of where we currently are. So, as part of this, we've been doing some thinking. So actually one of the things NPC does quite well is we deal with both organisations, charitable organisations and voluntary organisations and funders, is started to convene some conversations down in London, so I apologise, it's mostly sort of national bodies and umbrella groups we're talking to, about actually what is the voice and what stance does the sector take on this idea of place. So having come from a local government background, this is something I've been talking about for 15 years, about localism and how you do it. What I find coming over is quite interesting. At no level, seemingly, is the voice of the voluntary sector and charities taken seriously in that ongoing policy debate about what potential shifts to greater place-based approaches to how we work might be. So we've ended up having some conversations, and in October, a number of us met. And Kathy was there as well. And essentially, it's been published today. I think it's definitely in the sector press. The Guardian said it was a bit too abstract. And didn't contain the word Brexit, so it was unlikely to be reported. But essentially, we've come out with a declaration, a statement of intent, from some of the think tanks and the larger umbrella organisations to say, do you know what, we're going to step up to the plate and do some of this thinking. Now, we're not always going to agree, and we're not going to have a definitive line on what the social sector view on place is going to be, but it's time we started making some noise, and actually we ought to go back to local government, to central government, and crucially to our funders to say, hang on, we have a sense of agency in this debate and we want to tell you exactly what we think should be happening and what priorities we have. So, these are the organisations that signed up to it. So, NAVCA's involved, we're involved. There's a variety of different types of organisations, different specialisms. And I think the idea would be, hopefully we can get this sent around, Jane, Tom, after the conference. I want to be using this as a calling card for the next couple of months so we can all go out there and talk to our your member bodies, or talk to the charities we work with to see if they're interested in signing up. So we've got 6 or 7 bullet points of the things we think we need to be doing over the course of the next 12 months or so to get us into a much better and stronger place. We need to find a new word for place. Because actually once you say it once, you end up realising you say it about 14 times in a sentence. So essentially, the main thing about the declaration. So, essentially, like I said, we're a group of national charities, think tanks, social infrastructure and umbrella organisations that want to rethink how the social sector works with our partners, with our communities, and to further the causes we champion. We want to engage the people in the places where they live and they build communities and actually improve the efficacy of the sector, to improve our accountability and our legitimacy, basically in order to maximise our social impact and our charitable missions. So we've come together to advocate and begin to campaign for a broad shift in thinking towards more meaningful forms of place-based social change and transformation, adding our voices to the growing chorus of local government and progressive business figures calling for the same. I think service development, delivery and collaboration with local people to meet the needs of their place, as opposed to providing services that are merely delivered in that place, we think are key to actually developing some of this. It'll mean taking on new responsibilities, potentially, in the organisation of local places, in the partnerships and the strategies that underpin them. It will also require fresh collective thinking about the long-term future of commissioning and public service markets that already stretched to their limits after a decade of austerity. And as a group, we're committed to learning from those who are doing it well and helping those who aren't doing it yet. We will use our organisations to innovate, to disseminate best practice, share knowledge in the process. So essentially there are 7 pledges. Where the participatory element comes in is I want someone to talk about 4 of them. 3 of them, the first 3 are to discuss how better to shape and agree a place agenda. So I didn't really think I wanted to send you off into the groups to discuss about how you discuss it, so tick, I've done that one. The second one is to make a case for new models of place-based organisation. I'll come back to that after I've asked you to speak, because I think that's some of the work I'm doing, and I'm really keen to actually have conversations with people about it next year. And then the third one is about better utilisation of data. So it's quite key. One of those organisations involved is 360 Giving, who's done some fantastic work with their GrantNav platform, and there might be some really good news to come about that next year, so keep your eyes peeled. It's basically how we can share that data that we all have across sectors and with each other to start thinking, actually, how can we properly nail those outcomes that we are coming together to kind of try and grapple with and get our heads around. So, today's challenge, if you accept it. These are the 4, or these are a variation of the 4 remaining principles that we're talking about. So, this is the point, I'm going to ask you to go into 4 corners to organise yourself. I want one group to think about each one of these, and maybe have 10, 15 minutes to come back and then have some feedback. So the first one, if anyone does have this, you should sell it to the highest bidder if you've got the proper answer. How can we work together to better overcome austerity? I think the key here is actually from where we are, how can we actually sort out commissioning to be better? Also, in the knowledge that we have to actually do the commissioning as it is at the moment before we get to the place where we think we could do it better. The second one is actually, what are the local tools that are being developed to help communities and charities, businesses and public services to build up and renew their place networks to make them more vibrant and to make them more resilient for some of these challenges ahead. The third one basically is, if you had a blank piece of paper, how could we agree priorities for reinvestments in social infrastructure, and how can we make this happen? I think something we argued for in our submission to civil society strategy, if you all remember that, was essentially that if there was going to be a return to some limited grant funding, we wanted that to be targeted at areas of low social value, and we wanted that money to go into extra investment and support for the new lots, for social infrastructure bodies. We had a nice line back saying, well, we are right to do it, but we're not going to do it in a targeted way, because quite frankly, they didn't want to put the word redistribution into the report. And then the fourth bit, which is basically more of a soul-searching question, this concept of what does improvement look like in the social sector? What help and development needs are there out there, and actually how can we overcome them? And actually what can some of the think tanks and the bigger bodies, not just NAVCA, but NCDO and some of the big charities, if we could come together to help upskill and provide you with that support, what would it look like? Because the same senior exec from Surrey who told me he had a lot of money to try and find, basically said he wants to work with a lot of social bodies, but looking at the transformation his organisations have gone through the past 10 years, he's not quite sure that many of the organisations that you represent are up to the challenge of working with sufficiently transformed units of local government. I think in my head, ideally, I want to be a set of Lego. We can all snap together around our areas where we are. I think that's actually how we potentially get to that place. So, if you could now stand up and flex and discuss, probably give it to about 11:30. So, over to you.
Either 1, 2, 3, 4.
What do you want to do? One each? Yeah, basically, in these 4 groups, it's 1 each, and maybe if you just kind of do the corners of the room you're in, that's fine.
On the principle of not trying to herd cats, can I suggest if we break into the 4 groups and then I'll nip round and we'll allocate 1 topic per group. Does that make sense? Is that suitable?
That makes sense.
Okay, I should have been much more prescriptive from the get-go, obviously. We've got like 2-minute warning, and then I'm going to ask for some feedback. Okay, everyone. If you could just bring your conversations to a close, and then you have your allotted champion to come forward and give like 2 minutes or so about what we've been speaking about. It's that lovely moment when you do this, I'll just see what I can. Okay, everyone. Can you come back then and give me some feedback, please?
You want one from each group?
Okay then, mindful of the time, and I know that we might be overrunning the tea anyway. So, Alison's team, who's going to give the feedback? You, okay. Robin?
Delighted to be nominated, thank you. So, people have the question then?
Yeah.
So we had some personalities in our group, and Sally start this off. So first of all, we questioned the question just to be difficult in terms of why are we necessarily suggesting that reforming commissioning will help with austerity. So we almost wanted to take that austerity bit, put it to one side and talk more about commissioning.
We spoke about, is commissioning necessarily a system that we wanted to reform, or would we like to have something completely different? But we did talk about some great examples. Sorry, where are you? Rotherham, where an infrastructure organisation like ourselves could be tasked with ensuring some of those smaller groups are able to access commissioning. So examples of where it can really work. We also then start to talk about social prescribing and some of the pressures to try and look at how social prescribing can achieve short-term outcomes, where actually, if we're talking about preventative work, those outcomes could be further down the line, and maybe we need to be supported to be able to invest in it long-term rather than try and get some quick wins. Any other bits I've missed?
Good summary.
Yes.
Great. Thank you very much. I'll go to this group at the front next.
Yeah, we were doing a number 4, random list really. Personal relationships are vital, but behaviours aren't always helpful. So some sector improvement around that would be good. We thought that involving service users to try and shift commissioning is really critical, but hard to do. We also thought that we need to look at local government that is changing. There are some really good examples, not all the bad ones, and they're doing things differently, and often they do that by working with civil society closely. Example in Cambridge, for example, Barnsley, Preston, etc. Skilling up local people to be involved in those discussions and not just doing it ourselves is really vital. But there was a very strong feeling, and I checked this out before I did the note, that we don't want nationals coming to tell locals how to do the local, and particularly national charities competing locally, and that we are not disconnected from place. So, challenge back to you.
That was so far away from what I was suggesting. That's fine, don't worry, I'm not suggesting that. So, complete point taken. Then John's group in the back quarter. So, wants to speak back?
So our group was basically number 3 agreed priorities for reinvestment in social infrastructure, so I'll take that one first. So reinvestment through co-producing with us, strategic planning, strategic developments, being part of this inclusive economy approach, so making sure that inclusive economy is not just about procurement of goods and services, but making sure that there's procurement of community infrastructure, social infrastructure, and making sure that basically a lot of discussions I've recently had is about people, certainly in the funding world, commissioning world, duplicating a lot of funding priorities, a lot of money going into the same places, and not necessarily creating the impact that's needed, so thinking about how we realign that and work together towards a more place-based solution. So how do we make this happen? It's critical that the community and the voluntary community sector are part of the solution. We need strong, trusting relationships with local authorities, with the local NHS and other funders, and also mutual accountability, making sure that it's not just one way, but actually, somebody mentioned, mayor's pledges, making sure that we're able to make sure that locally everybody's accountable. So it's not about the voluntary community sector going in talking about where's the money, where's our money, but actually saying how do we mobilise the sector to enable integrated, combined, blended solutions, which is about place-based impact and progress.
Okay, great stuff. Then finally, over there.
So we were doing number 2,
locally developed tools to help communities, charities, blah, blah, blah. Where we got to was basically recognise where the real knowledge of a place is, and it might not be in any of those things. It might not be in organisations, it might just be in local people, and go and talk to them is probably a good place to start. And even within those organisations, it might not necessarily be where you think it is. So we were talking about going out and talking to the community police rather than the chief constable of the area and all that sort of stuff. Use creative approaches. Don't have an idea that you can just develop a network. You have lots of networks. It's a fluid conversation. It's constantly evolving, reforming. In fact, it should keep constantly reforming, because otherwise you get that thing of very staid, static networks where it gets dominated by one or two voices over many years. Lots of stuff about tools. Planning for real change was an example from Leicester. Actually, we know perfectly well how to do this stuff. We used to call it community development, and if people would just give us money and let us get on with it, we'd solve all that, because we've been banging on about it for decades, but also tell the story of how it works.
Cool. Okay, well, thanks very much, everyone. Running out of time, but quickly, just to finish off here. So essentially, those last two, of course, the next 6 months, I think we're going to be doing some work at PC at least, and then also some of the organisations. And actually, I'd like to come back, if I can, via NAVCA to kind of, if not actually come and talk to you, but maybe sort of have some conversations with you remotely. I think two things I'm looking at are issues about new models of place, particularly, which is quite frankly, off the back of all that stuff I was saying about the financial position and just generally where we are socially. It can't continue. It isn't right. It's not fit for purpose. So, on two levels, what would it look like if actually you could get the social and the public and indeed the private sectors in the places where you live to have a much more rational, consolidated relationship and discussion about actually how they want to organise that local authority area, and to start having a more mature relationship about actually how you devise that strategy, how you come together to agree that vision, and then off the back of that have discussions and conversations about basically many of you should not be involved or don't really want to be involved in commissioning as it is. You should be actually fundamentally co-designing the policy from the get-go, or ensuring that you are engaging with the local communities to ensure those policies make sense, and how do you work backwards, if you like. And the second part then is, this is about new funding models. I'm having some conversations about how we talk with funders to get them to start thinking differently about how they invest in local areas. And that's what I'm going to try and also have some conversation about, is if we could start looking back at that total place conversation of 10 years ago, if we could add to that charitable spend and then try and get philanthropic spend into that differently, what would it look like if we could blend the current funding streams to consolidate funding to properly try to sort of push the sort of transformational change in the areas you're operating in, instead of everybody feeding around trying to grab different bits of money and competing against each other. So that's what I kind of want to do. It might be a bit more than I might be biting off more than I can chew. But if I could have a conversation about that in the next 12 months, it would be really helpful. So there we go. Thank you very much. We've overran massively, but the tea and coffee is back in the room next door. Thanks.
I am going to let you go through your copy in a moment. Just before you do, though, just a quick show of hands or test the water a little bit. Given that we heard from Asif originally or earlier about the Pact and the Pact principles, and what we've just been talking about with Nathan around new models of place, quick show of hands. Are these conversations you're interested in continuing to have through NAVCA, through the NAVCA network, with your colleagues, with your peers? Yes, no? Great, excellent. We will carry that forward then. Thank you. Disrupt is good. We're going to be radical. Where's John? We're radical. So disruption is excellent. We are obviously running a wee bit behind time. So could I ask you, go and grab yourselves a coffee. I know you love to talk, but I want to make sure you have a bit more time at lunchtime to talk. Can you bring your copy back in again, and we will start with our Revolutionaries Roundtable in, I'll say 7.5 minutes. Darren's sitting down, everybody. Everybody else could be sitting down too. Ladies and gentlemen, hello. I know you can hear me. I've just said to somebody out in the corridor that my inner primary school teacher is trying very hard not to do the, well, it's your own time you're wasting line.
I don't think they're wasting time.
I know you're not wasting time, but we are trying to grab a little bit more time back into the programme so you have plenty of time to talk to the panellists that we're about to hear from. Oh, he's gone quiet now. Brilliant. So, hope you all feel a little bit refreshed and re-energised again now that you've had a moment to step outside the room. That's it. Hush at the back there. Thank you. So, I'm really pleased that we have 5 brilliant speakers. Asif we've already heard from obviously this morning, and Asif is going to chair our panel of revolutionaries. And I use that phrase quite advisedly. We have a principle when we're putting together the NAVCA event that we concentrate on who we get onto the stage, not who they work for or where they come from. Because we know that if we have fantastically interesting people on the stage, they will say fantastically interesting and challenging and provoking and thought-inspiring things to our audiences. So, today, we are very privileged to have with us, reading from left to right, Cathy Evans, who many of you I know anyway, Chief Executive of Children England, Rodri Davis, Head of Policy at the Charities Aid Foundation, Ian Burbidge, Ian's at the far end there, the Associate Director of Public Services and Communities at the RSA, and Dan Ebanks, who's co-founder and CEO of Firesalts. I'm going to say no more to introduce them. They're all more than capable of introducing themselves in whatever way they see fit. But I'd like to hand over now, if I may, to our first speaker.
Hello everyone. It's not easy when you build as the revolutionary is going to be a troublemaker all the time. It's like a tolerance level. You end up just all going, how much more revolutionary can I be? I don't know, but I'm not going to talk about markets. If you've heard me talk before and I've talked to this group, I'm actually not. Thought I'd take the opportunity to do something else. And to the undercover journalists in the audience, Andy and Dave, I've been asked to be contentious. So if you want to quote me, that's fine. But I'm working to agree. I just want to give a few little anecdotes, and they might not seem to add up at the beginning, but I'll share with you how I think they connect. The first is, think back to 2008, when the Lehman Brothers crashed and the world started realising that there was something really pretty spectacular going on. But none of the economic journalists or economists had seen it coming, and they were caught on the hop. And I happened to be having a visit from my friend who had a daughter who was 6 at the time, Lily, and we were sitting eating our beans on toast watching the 6 o'clock news, and Robert Peston was on there trying to explain simultaneously how he didn't really know what was going on and nobody did, but here's a graph to tell you what we think is going on, and what he charted was this is how bad we think it's going to be, and if we're right, then it could take until 2017 to get back to the kind of levels we were at in 2004. And Lily just turned around and she went, why would we want to go back to 2004? Won't the same thing happen again? And I've literally never forgot it. She didn't know what he was talking about. He didn't know what he was talking about. We didn't know what he was talking about, but she saw that that was wrong. It was just nonsense. And she shared a wisdom that she didn't know was wise. And she'd done no economics at the age of 6. My second quote, this is a quote from someone whose work I hugely admire up in Gateshead, and he works in the council on public service reform, which he considers himself doing one citizen at a time. And this is a quote from some of what he's been digesting as his learning so far. He said, multiple small-scale actions and interventions are more effective and often better value than large-scale provision. Most of the specific things that help people are small and unspectacular. A coffee, a chat, a food shop while benefits were being processed, a bus pass to aid a job search, and just to get people out of the house. Some basic clothes. These things are much more than their materiality. They help to solve everyday problems in the short term while building trust to create opportunities for long-term gains. They aren't commissionable and don't need assessing for. They came from decisions made by a core team based on the specific context of the person and their situation. This is what happens when our judgment is reclaimed from the front, by the front line from the boardroom. The third context in quote, and we've already heard reference to Grenfell. I really think we should talk about Grenfell more than we do, but still. Grenfell, in particular for me, gives us a huge challenge to the fallacies that we've built around the idea of accountability and service delivery. There are over 120 contracts out on Grenfell Tower, and not one person or organisation who's yet taken responsibility for Grenfell Tower. And there was an amazing poem written by Ben Ockery shortly after it, which literally, this rings around my head in virtually all the conversations that we have, particularly in commissioning and procurement. He said, there is cladding everywhere, political cladding, economic cladding, intellectual cladding, things that look good but have no centre, have no heart, only moral padding. So 2 weeks ago, I had an experience on Twitter. I don't know if some of you do follow me on Twitter. It was a bit of a nightmare weekend. I was getting toothache right down in the root, and I saw on Twitter a photograph of a room full of confinement booths that had been built, ceiling to floor, so that people could sit in the booth and not see anything but the wall ahead. And the headline told me this was a room in an English school, and that the children who are put in there for whole days because they wore the wrong shoes, or because they were 2 minutes late turning up. And so I was descended into a world that I knew nothing of before that moment, which is that there are over 500 schools who have isolation booth rooms built in, and that they are very proud of this as a management technique, and that there are armies. In the response to me putting that out, I then became immediately aware that there are parents who have taken their children out of schools to protect them from isolation and confinement for over 5 years, and I didn't know. But there were also a lot of teachers who feel very defensive and under onslaught by people thinking that this is a grotesque way to treat children. What that told me was there was no data, no research to tell me that that's wrong. I know that putting a small child in 7 hours confinement for a uniform breach is wrong. And the vast majority of people who reacted to it knew that too. But I'm up for, you know, I don't know which I hate. Of course there are people who think it's right. I want to have the debate with them. But something else happened. A whole load of people dove in and said, the problem here is that we don't have enough data to tell us if it's effective or not. That's what this problem is, and all of you are wrong. If you're in favour of it, you're just acting on impulse. You have no evidence, and if you're against it, you're just having a knee-jerk reaction. And that, for me, crystallised what a problem we have. It's a byproduct of the marketplace, but we have had our moral compasses outsourced to researchers. And there are some great researchers in this room. I love research for learning, but no researcher can tell me what's right or wrong. No research ever does very much more than to say what this situation needs is more research. So this narrative, it robs us of our truth, it persuades us we don't know anything ourselves, it redefines evidence as just data, and that's not true. It tells us we shouldn't trust our own feelings, our own moral beliefs, as if we don't know injustice when we see it, when we feel it, when we experience it. So like slow boiling frogs in a pressure cooker of austerity, we've been encouraged to outsource our moral compasses to research. We have a plethora of what works centres, what works in PFI, and that was announced on the back of saying PFI doesn't work. We don't need to know what works, what we need to know is what's right, what's wrong, what helps, and what doesn't work, because we are at a point in time where we have to learn from our mistakes and not repeat them. So, I'm going to end with a quote from Gandhi. I don't know if you know that Gandhi had views on impact measurement. He said, "It's the action, not the fruit of the action, that's important. You have to do the right thing. It may not be in your power, may not be in your lifetime, that there'll be any fruit, but that doesn't mean you stop doing the right thing. You may never know what results come from your action, but if you do nothing, there will be no result."
Right, hello everybody. I've got a deeply unenviable task now of following what I thought was a very powerful speech. Luckily I'm talking about a totally different topic, so if we start from that point of view, everybody give me a benefit of the doubt. So I'm Rodri, I head up policy at Charities Aid Foundation, but the more relevant thing in a way that I do there is I run a thing called Giving Thought, which is essentially kind of our in-house think tank. So it's just a bit of space we've carved out to think about core issues affecting charities and civil society here and around the world, but from a slightly bigger picture and longer term perspective. And one of the things I've been doing for the last 5 years is thinking about the impact of kind of emerging and disruptive technology on charities. And that's what I want to talk to you about today, and one way in which I think it's particularly relevant to the sorts of organisations that are in the room today. So my starting point is I don't think technology is something that we can see as happening over there or kind of a specific issue that we don't need to pay attention to anymore. I think we're all aware that technology is affecting our lives in terms of the way we work, the way we interact, the entertainment that we have, the way we communicate. And it's affecting all of us and society more widely. And the pace of change is not just fast, it's rapidly accelerating. So I think it's impossible for us to put our heads in the sand any longer. And I think technology is going to affect civil society and organisations within it in 3 broad ways. So the first is that there are some amazing opportunities to use technology for good, to understand the problems we're trying to address more effectively, and to find new inventions that could potentially produce great outcomes. The second is that even if you don't particularly see the value in that, the impact on the wider operating environment is going to be such that it's going to affect the organisations that we all work for in lots of different ways, and we need to understand that. And the third is that even if you're not particularly bothered about that, technology is going to have a profound impact on the sorts of people and communities that we're all trying to serve. And if we don't understand the way in which technology is changing the nature of those challenges, we might fail to be relevant in a few years' time. And what I want to specifically focus in on is the way in which technology is affecting our ability to organise, and what I see as a really interesting shift to a very old model of organisation, which is less about hierarchies and more about flat structures and networks. So in the commercial sphere at the moment, it's well known that a lot of the biggest companies in the world are platforms, not centralised organisations anymore. So it's, it's an oft-repeated fact that Uber, for instance, is the largest transport company in the world, doesn't own any cars. Airbnb is the largest property company in the world, doesn't own any cars. And actually this shift from feeling like you have to own things and act as the gatekeeper of resources towards acting as a platform where you put people in touch with the services and assets that they need is quite profound. Obviously, you can throw up some challenges about whether Uber and Airbnb truly are decentralised, but let's park that for a moment. And the question is, we're seeing this happening in the social sphere as well. So there are new platforms that enable people to give directly to people in the developing world and within their own communities, but also networked social movements. So if you think about a lot of the big social change movements of the last few years, like Black Lives Matter, Me Too, the response to the school shootings in the US, the response to Grenfell, none of those were led by traditional centralised civil society organisations. They were much looser networks of people coming together organically and trying to work out how best to address their problems. And my question is, should we in the more traditional bits of civil society be excited by this change or feel challenged by it? I think network models could bring huge positives in terms of rebalancing power, addressing some of the issues that perhaps have been highlighted around trust in the sector, giving people more of a sense of agency. But I do also think there are questions in terms of what this means for people in traditional civil society organisations. If you're excited by the potential of network models, how do you engage with them without stifling them? There's been some interesting stuff around the way in which the Ford Foundation in the US has tried to support Black Lives Matter and has come in for a lot of criticism in terms of the way it's tried to kind of reshape the focus of that organisation. And are we genuinely happy giving away power? It's very easy to say we like to give away power, but actually when push comes to shove, are we? And I think also we need to be aware that even if network models bring some amazing potential and opportunities, they will raise new challenges. How do you make decisions within a horizontal structure where there are no obvious points at which decision making can be centralised? Where's the accountability for who follows through on those decisions and what happens if it goes wrong? How do you ensure that you have long-term voice and influence if it's difficult to identify the leaders within that? Or even for authorities to decide for themselves who are the leaders of the movement and choose the ones that they find easiest to deal with? What about the hidden hierarchies that inevitably emerge within flat structures? What about the missing infrastructure for the long term that might be left behind if these things come to scale much faster than has ever been possible before? And what about the dependence on individual personalities and relationships rather than organisational forms that is inevitable if you start talking about decentralised approaches? So my question really is, should traditional organisations be highlighting some of these flaws and actually saying we should put the brakes perhaps on this, this excitement around network social movements, or should they be supporting and nurturing these movements at a local area and nationally? And I think one thing is for certain, the space for doing social good in the future, as plenty of people have highlighted, is going to be more crowded. Businesses are coming in trying to co-opt the idea of doing social good, but equally there are all these new forms of organisation available to people in communities to do things at scale in a way they were previously unable to. And the question really is, when it comes to these networks, do charities and civil society organisations embrace the potential of them, or do they see their role as resisting some of the challenges they bring? And I think local organisations are uniquely well placed here, because these issues that everybody in the digital space is suddenly discovering about accountability and decision making and the problems of hidden hierarchies, they're not new. And actually, people organising within civil society have been dealing with them for hundreds of years. So actually, I think organisations like yours have something genuinely really interesting and insightful to tell people who are starting to engage with this idea of digital organisation. So that's my challenge. Thank you.
Hello everybody, my name's Dan. I can't work out whether I'm nervous because I'm talking to you or because I'm in a church. I keep thinking about what I've done wrong recently. I am very happy to be here though. as I've intimated, I'm not very good at this, so I'm going to get straight to the point. Hopefully what I've got to say is more important than how I say it. I want to talk to you about an opportunity to put millions of pounds of resources and funding into local VCSE organisations, but also failure, and the failure of local government to fully, I stress, to fully realise that opportunity. I'm here to share information, but then it's really about kind of throwing that challenge back to the local CVS. So we all know the situation financially that the sector is in. We've already heard people talking about what's been happening over the last kind of 10 years or so. And I remember watching a documentary about Blacker Dread. Did anyone see that? It's about a Rastafarian based in Brixton, and people have got their opinions on how Blacker came across, but one thing he did say was that this decade is the decade that they'll look back on where they'll say that a lot of kids and young people were cut adrift because of the cuts in services. And it's not a great time at the moment. People are feeling less welcome in our communities. People feel that they can't access basic social care services. Newcomers are no longer feeling welcome. And people are feeling that, then it's likely that people are at breaking point. So I told you this would happen. So there's a law called the Social Value Act. I'm sure that many of you have come across this before. Now, what this act does, it allows government to leverage its spending. Okay? So essentially, every time government spends any money on the private sector, it can ask that private sector supplier to create benefits for local communities. Okay? So what this means, every single time government spends money, the local VCS organisation should be able to benefit from resources or from some kind of opportunity. And so far, this has been used for £25 billion worth of resources, which sounds like an awful lot of money to everybody in this room. But just consider that every single year, government spends £268 billion on private sector suppliers. That's a mind-boggling amount of money. And these are private sector suppliers that are themselves making billions of pounds in profit from the public sector. So of that 25 billion, my organisation has helped government to create around 600 grand of resources for local VCSE organisations. And if you do the maths on that, that means that theoretically, from £268 billion, we're talking about around 6 billion in resources and funding for the VCSE sector, if all of that was leveraged. And of course, that's never going to be the case, but it just shows you the kind of sort of sums that we're talking about here. So we've done it, we know that it's true, we know that it works. I mean, it probably sounds too good to be true, so why isn't this happening all across the country? Well, it's happening in lots of places. I can see Mike here from Manchester, and I've heard Mike talk at great length about the work that's being done in Manchester, and you do see this all over the country, but it's not everywhere, and it should be everywhere. So why isn't it everywhere? Why isn't the Act being used in every single procurement? Now, there are some thresholds, so above certain amounts, or rather below certain amounts, the Act isn't applicable, but it's still a huge amount of spend where it's not being applied. Now, the legislation becomes mandatory from next summer. It begins to become mandatory from next summer. David Lidington announced a few weeks ago that they're going to start to make it so for central government contracts. But the direction of travel is clear. It's only going to be going one way. So why isn't it happening in local government? Again, I think it comes back to a point that was made a moment ago, which is around accountability. Because local government don't have to do it, it's not being done, in my opinion. Because they don't have to do it, they're not being marked on it. So they're not doing it. And the insanity of the situation is that with more resources in the VCSE sector, the easier and cheaper the lives are of local government, of councils. A better, a healthier, a stronger VCSE sector means less pressure on local government services. And yet, even with this policy instrument to hand, they still aren't using it because they're not being marked on it. So I'm going to finish off by really just throwing that challenge to you as local CVS organisations to put that pressure, to hold your council officers accountable, to put your councillors under the pressure to make them start to use the Social Value Act and the legislation and to see more resources going into your organisations. Thank you very much.
Afternoon. I always have to do this a little bit. Okay. I'll end up with a speak when I'm older. My name's Ian. I'm an ex-local government officer, and I'm not the only one in the room. And I'm going to talk about commissioning. When I was writing this on the train coming up, I was thinking, oh man, I always get up talking about commissioning, and nobody's going to be interested. And then I kind of went back to in my old role. I used to do all of this stuff. I used to do investment and service level agreements and all of that around the voluntary and community sector. And I just thought, actually, you are going to be interested. And then that's all I've heard so far this morning. So let's see if I can just frame this in a way which is helpful or might resonate, given that I knew that I was doing things that weren't most effective in the past. So this is therapy for me too. Just very, very quickly, I've only got a few moments, but put your hand up if you are in an area where your local authority or other public sector funders are really rethinking the way that they're putting funding into the local voluntary and community sector. Awesome. I'm really pleased to see that, and I really didn't know whether there would be one hand in the room or not. So my plea, which I will make at the start, and primarily because I might forget at the end, is I'd really like to hear what that's looking like. Because I think a number of us are thinking about how we might tease out what's working and spread it. So what I'm going to do is say, for those areas that aren't doing that, then why not? Why are we not coming up with new and innovative ways of doing this stuff? Why are we persisting with a broken system, a broken way of doing things? And I'm going to give you two thoughts on why that might be, a couple of ideas as to what we might do differently. So we're stuck with this deficit model, clearly, whereby we identify a community or a cohort of people or a part of the population that have got something that we perceive to be lacking in terms of needs or in terms of aspirations or whatever else it might be, and then we specify it and we put it out and we want people to apply, and we go through all of that competitive process. But really that's a massive waste of everybody's time and effort, I would argue, because you guys working on the ground already know this stuff. So what I'm talking about is how we can rebalance the conversation, and I've heard that already this morning. Adam Kahani's written a brilliant book you can get hold of called Collaborating with the Enemy, and in it he describes a whole load of really insightful perspectives. One of them he calls the sort of linear fallacy, this three-step process by which you figure out the problem. He says smart people figure out the problem, think about the solution, then they get that signed off by their superiors and budget holders, and then they push it down to their teams to implement. And when stuff doesn't work as we think it should, it's always perceived to be a failure of implementation and execution, not the fact that the world's moved on in the time it's taken us to sort of clunk our way through that linear process. Think about how we go on a journey together. Because in a complex system, all you can do is intervene, seek feedback, learn from that feedback, and take another step forward. So how, and that's not something you can commission for, that's not something that you can pay as a public sector funder, an organisation to go do. That's a journey that everybody in the system has to go on together, and that's a difficult journey, and it's a shift in the way we think about investing in understanding problems and moving towards potential impact. And that takes long-term trust and commitment, and I would argue that that commitment isn't just words or money or action, but it's a combination of all of those things, and it's an understanding that you're in this for the long run. I'm out of time, so I'm going to stop talking there. I'm really keen to continue this conversation with folks in the room, and if you follow me on Twitter, you'll be able to find loads of stuff that I've written or published about this. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. Yep. 4 great speakers, and we thank you so much for keeping on time as well. We've got about 10 minutes. This was a bit of a sort of squeeze session this afternoon. So what I'm going to do is we're going to open it up for questions, thoughts. If you have them for specific panel members, please say. If I could ask you to say who you are when you ask your question or make your comment, and also try and keep it succinct so that a few people get a chance to talk. Thank you.
Hello. I enjoyed all of the speeches, they were fantastic, and the example of the children at school was very close to home, so really great to hear that. But I actually wanted to talk about social value, and to ask, why do you think there's been this low take-up? Is it because, for example, we found in our area, we're developing a model to try and do it with one of our district councils that's actually working very, very well. And our experience is that people don't understand it. People don't, it's social value sounds boring, jargony, dull, public sector, not for us, not in the community. And so I think, so I wonder to the extent to which, is that the barrier, or is it sort of state resistance? What's going on, do you think?
Is this on? Yeah. Was I shouting earlier? No. So I think in terms of the policy itself, I think that it's not very prescriptive. I think it's quite an open, some might say vaguely kind of worded piece of legislation and piece of policy. I think that, for some people that's a blessing, and others it's a curse. Some people need to have very clear instruction on how to apply it, and others don't. So I think at a very high level, that's one of the issues with it. But I think my answer is to that, just get on with it. And it's not a case of necessarily getting on with it and begging for forgiveness. It's not far off that. So that's what I would suggest. Your procurement guys will always come down and say, you can or can't do this. So I would say kind of get on with it, just get on with it. I think that over the years, it's been 5 years now, it's quite a long time. I wouldn't say you could call it a new thing anymore, but I think that two of the main issues that have slowed it down, number one is the kind of the measurement question, which I think is a bit of a red herring, to be perfectly honest. I think, on the one hand, you've got incredibly kind of complex and smart SROI type tools, and you can't run those for every single procurement, you just can't do it. On the other hand, you've got kind of online calculators, some of which are pretty good. The HACT model is pretty good, and social value portal, again, is pretty good, but then there are also some snake oil merchants out there too. So you have to be very careful about what you use. But I think measurements held it up. And then, of course, the elephant in the room with social value is who pays for it. And I think that there is a huge, there's still a lack of understanding. I think, again, apologies to any procurement people in the room, but I think there is a lack of understanding and belief in what social value is and how it can be made to work. I think there are sort of perverse incentives. I mean, government's being asked to save money on the one hand and then boost value on the other, which is a challenge. But I would say measurement and who pays for it are things that have slowed it down. But it's coming and it's not going away. So, is that okay?
Yeah, thank you. I really agree about the complexity thing. One of our local authorities has come up with what I might term as a 5-dimensional spreadsheet that you have to try and use if you want, and it's ridiculous. So yeah, it's very helpful to hear people.
Can I just add then on social value, I agree with everything that's been said in terms of positive encouragement. We hear some really awful tales within my membership of social value criteria being misused to seek subsidy, pay to play, discounts on prompt payment. And I'm part of the Crown, the BCS Crown Rep Advisory Group. One of the things we've been discussing in that, and I'm trying to encourage my members to do, is to use the mystery shopper function at the Cabinet Office, where you can report bad commissioning practice. And it's very clear, Social Value Act misuse is bad commissioning practice. It can be stopped. So, I just wanted to add, we've got some teeth in the negative end.
Thank you. Any other questions, thoughts? Wendy at the front here.
It's not about social value, it's about voices getting heard. And I recognise that there is diversity within the CVS movement, but not, if you look out at the sea of faces, you won't see many BME faces. And I just wonder, do you think that's as a result of racist recruitment processes in the sector, or do the AME sector organise separately? And if it is about racism, how can we change that?
Well, I've got a contribution to make rather than thinking that it would solve everything to do with structural inequality and lack of diversity. But we do run a campaign called Open to All. We're pretty clear that charities have no good reason to be requiring degrees for any jobs that we do. And you know, I mean, there might be the odd registered social work post. It's not about being anti-qualification. It's about the fact that we've fallen into, like slow boiling frogs, the habit of filtering job opportunities by saying degree level degree level is a requirement for a job when it's not. And actually, you know, I've got a degree, but nothing I did in my degree taught me how to be a chief exec. So all the rest is game. But you know, we have to say that there must be something in our recruitment practices. There must be. And whether it's overt, whether it's only about race, it's really about class. This is the most middle class sector I know. And I count myself in that. And going to university as a minimum requirement is the most middle class thing I've ever heard of.
Somebody at the back who'd like to speak? Get the microphone over there, please. Oh, yeah, the green t-shirt. Thanks. Got two microphones. So, is that right there? Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Mohammed. I'm from Hackney CVS, a CVS working in London. I mean, the speakers were really amazing actually about different issues that are also affecting the charities actually working from the civil side. And I also Kathy mentioned about the effectiveness of interventions, whether it's positive, and whereas the data is backing it up, and also in terms of commissioning services. So when we're talking about commissioning services, how you actually find that there's a gap in the service, and also you base the outcomes of the commissioning basically based on what you're trying to achieve. I mean, my question is how we as a voluntary sector can actually feed into that and also provide the local knowledge and the evidence, so we fill in that gap to inform the commissioners of what's needed to be done, rather than actually chasing the contracts or the commissioning processes to achieve outcomes that are set out by others.
I think you were asking for the Holy Grail question, because that's the one that we all want to solve, right? I was talking to somebody a couple of weeks ago, and they were saying that they were just scaling up a program of work around lifelong learning, which 10 years ago they'd scaled back down again, and now it was suddenly a priority again. So it's this idea that things become a priority, are deprioritised, become a priority again, when actually that need would have always been there. And if we have a model which is much more conversational and much more, let's understand our communities together and bring a range of perspectives to do so, then we can figure out what's needed, and we don't have to necessarily dream up a new initiative, throw some money at it, and then it's the firework approach. So I guess the crucial piece there would be how you can start to have those conversations on an ongoing basis with, as I was trying to describe earlier, other actors in the system around the key areas.
I think we've got time for one more. There's two more actually. So there's this person at the back, and then this lady here. That's going to be the last. It's a brave person that stands between people and their lunch. So I think we'll just take a couple, if that's okay with the rest of you, and then we'll wind up. Okay, thank you.
I'll be brief. David Fannin, Lincolnshire, CVS. I agree with Dan on the Social Value Act. I think it's problematic in the way it's used. But my question is for Ian. In Lincolnshire, for example, we have, we're just about to commission, the County Council is about to commission an integrated lifestyle support service linked to healthier lifestyles, STP programs and things like that. And the commissioning side are talking the language of enlightenment, changing people's lives, integration, outcomes, working together. And the procurement side are talking about numbers. And it's the two absolutely different ends of the message. So the question for Ian is, moving from that transactional to the more enlightened thinking, what can NAVCA do? What would your advice to NAVCA be to help us at the local level mobilise the arguments for enlightenment rather than transactional thinking?
Can you just hold on to that question for a minute? Could we just have the other question? Thank you.
It's Karen from Reading Voluntary Action. And I was really struck by just sort of stringing together everything we just heard. I think I'm adding to the previous question, which is simply knowing what's right, knowing what's being done that's good, but thinking about the way in which activities are happening through platforms rather than through organisations, and what on earth does that mean, and how does that tie into thinking around how any of this stuff's paid for, particularly in the peculiar environment we're in at the moment. So I suppose it's similarly what can NAVCA be doing, but thinking about what does it mean for us trying to support and nurture and grow voluntary action if we start thinking about platforms rather than organisations.
Okay, I'll kick off and I'll try and join some of this together. The move towards more enlightened commissioning in Lincolnshire, well, the fact that you're having these conversations is a good thing. What can NAVCA do? Well, I think there's something which starts to tie together the need to have a sort of a moral values-based approach that moves us away from those sort of accountancy-driven value-for-money type exercises where if only you can evidence you've got 1,000 people through the door and you can divide that by the cost of doing so, you've got some sort of sense of value. We need to move beyond that. We need to think fundamentally about social value, but in its widest context. And I think there's an exercise, I mean, I flippantly talk at the RSA about public entrepreneurs. There are people in our public services trying to grapple with this stuff, but the system often says no. And what we need to do is to find ways of starting to mobilise behind a movement for change that says there is a different way of doing this, because we know that it's necessary, it's the only way we can do this. And I think what I'm keen to do is to try and mobilise a coalition of people that are trying to move in this direction. So that includes NAVCA, that includes others in the room, and it's about figuring out what good looks like and how we can share innovative practice.
I think all three of our panellists would like to say a little bit something to your question, and so I'll invite them to do that, and maybe closing comments as well.
Yeah, just a very, very quick comment about platforms and tech, and that's what I do, but I hate to come to these places and almost talk about that because it just sounds, it's like if someone else is banging that drum. But I think, very, very simply, for me, the way to explain why platforms can work, and not they shouldn't, it isn't the default, but why they can work is that they're simply about connecting organisations for mutual benefit. So if there's an organisation that wants something on one hand, and there's another organisation that can deliver it on the other, there's just a matching thing that platforms can do, which can be done in real life, but of course it can be done at a much greater scale and faster. So that's all I would say, that the kind of benefits of a platform. But again, I would stress that this isn't a panacea, it's not a cure-all to all of the challenges that we've been discussing today.
No, I mean, just building on that, I think there are ways in which sort of platform-based models actually can just help with the more sort of rational allocation of resources, where you already know what you want to do and how you're going to measure it, and that's one thing. I think where the challenge might come is that if we're talking about sort of actually decentralising power and allowing people to kind of connect and organise in different ways, I think that will be in tension with the idea that somebody can set objectives for you, come in and tell you how you're going to be able to measure them. And actually the mindset about giving away power, that extends to power to decide what it is that you're trying to do and how you're going to measure it. And then that raises all sorts of questions about accountability. I mean, are public sector commissioners ever going to be comfortable with that? Do we need to talk about new accountability mechanisms and different ways of using transparency? And I'll just leave with the thought, I was talking to somebody the other day about this exact problem, and he said he talked to a funder who was really excited about kind of decentralised models, and had reached out to a small sort of platform organisation and said, we want to give you some money, what can we do? And they said, give us the strong expletive money and then strong expletive off.
Do you get any money?
TBC.
I don't know about different diverse kinds of platforms. To quote my friend and colleague Toby Lowe, outcomes are real. They are a real thing. I'm not trying to disabuse anyone that we can't do well or badly, and we shouldn't be asking when we do. Outcomes are emergent properties from complex systems. So you know about them once you've gone through a process. You do not achieve them by setting them 2 years ahead and then looking at them. Because that's where all of the different ways in which you might actually be able to do something to help become blinkered out and become somebody else's job. So, for funders, public or charitable, what I would say is that you need to be looking for organisations that have clear inbuilt habits around learning, critical reflection and change. If you have an organisation that is gathering evidence, taking critical feedback, reflecting on whether we're doing the right thing, allowing people to adapt as we go along because different needs are presenting. What you need to know is that they are learning and they will be able to present you with evidence of what they've learnt along the way, rather than saying, what do you promise to deliver and you need to tell us that you did. Because that's not deliverable, it's not true. So what you're paying for is data, and often false data.
Thank you very much. So I propose we close now for lunch. Could you join me please in thanking our speakers? Hope you have a lovely lunch and continue the discussions. Cheers.
You'll all disappear. Lunch is back in the main room, obviously where we've had all the refreshments. We will be starting back again at 1:30, where I'm delighted to be joined by Baroness Tina Stahl. I know she's on a tight time scale, so we will start promptly at 1:30. And then we have our afternoon of provocations and piracy. So go and enjoy your lunch, and we'll see you back here in 45 minutes. Thank you.